over to you. Whenever you're ready, Howie.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Rabbi. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see everybody. It's nice to see familiar faces and names and unfamiliar faces and names. Welcome. It's nice to see everyone. I just want to say at the outset, it's nice to see everyone, but I'm also hoping this is the last time we have to do this by Zoom. At the next series I do for Beth Am, we'll be in person and we can be in the same room. Here's hoping. But for this evening, thank you for that introduction, Rabbi. And it's always a pleasure to speak for Beth Am. Obviously, I'm very biased. We've been members of Beth Am for a long time, and so it's always I enjoy speaking public in the community in general. But Beth Am is always a very nice, special place to speak as well. So in this series, what we're going to do is really going to do two things at the same time. We're going to focus on four major events in the Jewish world in the last century or so, or a little bit more. But we're not only going to look at the events themselves, but these events are more or less, I would say, familiar. But we also really want to look at how these events are reported in Jewish newspapers. So we're going to study four events: Dreyfus, Balfour, Madoff, Abraham Accords, in 4 sessions. But we also want to look at the role that the Jewish press, Jewish daily and weekly newspapers play in Jewish life. And so I imagine these events there's a certain familiarity to them, but I don't know how much you've had a chance to really think about what it means to have a Jewish newspaper and the function and the purpose that the Jewish newspaper provides. So before I dive into tonight's topic, which is going to be Dreyfus, let me say just a general word or two about the impact of Jewish newspapers. First of all, in case you don't know, Jewish daily and weekly newspapers have not been around for very long. The oldest Jewish weekly newspaper, well, the first one, there was a kind of short-lived experiment in the 1780s and the 1790s. There was a Jewish newspaper called HaMe'asef, the gatherer, the assembler, whose function was basically to expose European Jews to the Hebrew language, Hebrew poetry. It was more of a literary journal than it was a newspaper. The first real Jewish newspapers really began in the 1830s, which is not that long ago. Now, as a phenomenon, a Jewish newspaper serves two related purposes. First of all, a Jewish newspaper is what we might call a reflection of change, or a reflection of what's going on. When you look at a newspaper, think about whether it's a Jewish newspaper like the Jewish News, or a newspaper like the Detroit Free Press, or the Wall Street Journal, or the New York Times, or whatever. This is a window into a moment in time. Much of what a newspaper focuses on are things that are happening, current events, things that are happening right now. And so when we use Jewish newspapers as a source to understand the past, it's a window into a specific moment in the past. And in that sense, a Jewish newspaper is a reflection of change. But there's a second function as well. Jewish newspapers weren't only gatherers of news. They weren't only disseminating events from one Jewish community to another. They were also themselves agents of change. For those members of the Jewish community who wanted to make a change in Jewish life, advocate for a new kind of situation, be it a religious change, be it a political change, an economic change, a social change, the Jewish newspaper was a very effective way to reach a lot of people very quickly. Before there were Jewish newspapers, before there were daily newspapers in general, it was difficult to reach a broad audience quickly. Think about it. In the absence of a newspaper, how would someone who wanted their ideas or their opinions to reach a large crowd, if you couldn't see people face to face, it was very difficult. You could send a message, you could publish a book, which people might or might not read. You could write a pamphlet. But the impact of the Jewish newspaper, well, the impact of newspapers in general, was the first step towards what we might call the democratization of knowledge. Newspapers were inexpensive. They were accessible. They were relatively easily available to many people. So if an individual was literate, you didn't have to be rich. You didn't have to be privileged. Anyone could get a hold. And if you could read, you yourself could find out. And you could, in a sense, you could communicate directly with the people contributing. And so within the Jewish world as well, Jewish newspapers become these catch-alls, these umbrellas for all kinds of ideas. So when you flip through the pages of Jewish newspapers, past and present, you're not only seeing news reporting, you're seeing essay writing, you're seeing opinions, op-eds, you're seeing letters from readers. And maybe the most interesting part, you're seeing advertisements. You can understand is what people are interested in acquiring. That Jewish newspapers have had personal ads ever since the first Jewish newspaper came out. Now, one of the things I'm going to do each week when we look at a particular topic, obviously I'm not going to use every single newspaper for every topic. I'm going to choose a couple of key ones. And I want to highlight, at the beginning, I want to highlight the newspapers that we're going to be using. So can I share my screen?
Yeah.
If you want to look at your source sheet, can everyone see? I think you should be able to see mine as well. Let me just give you a sense, just give you a taste of the newspapers we're going to use this evening to study the Dreyfus affair, and then we'll dive into the Dreyfus affair. So I've chosen, I've chosen four: 3 Jewish newspapers and 1 French newspaper. So the French newspaper, this is one all the way on the right, it's called L'Aurore. And this means, well, it's like the word aurora, and this is French for the dawn. Now, if you come across a newspaper that's called the Dawn, even if you know nothing else about it, you already can know the orientation of that newspaper. There is no way that a conservative newspaper is going to be called the Dawn. The Dawn is going to be progressive, liberal, something advocating change as opposed to continuity. I will go on a limb and say there has never been a conservative newspaper called the Dawn. They tend to be, more stable types. So that's the non-Jewish one. And there are 3 Jewish newspapers here. So first we have the first weekly Jewish newspaper ever published was called the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentum, which means it's sort of, this would be called the World Jewish Times. And this was published in Brunswick, Germany, beginning in 1837. And this is a newspaper in the way we understand it. It has lead stories, it has essays, and it has news reporting all over the world. It continued to be published all the way into the 1930s when it was shut down by Hitler. But during the Dreyfus affair, which, as we'll see, was in the 1890s, it was an important newspaper in reporting. Because it was an important newspaper, but also became, and this is where we get the sense of agent of change. This being a German Jewish newspaper, it wasn't simply reporting about Dreyfus as a Jewish event. It was reporting about Dreyfus as a French Jewish event. And we see a little bit of that German Jewish bias against, French Jews. We'll come back to that. Then we have a newspaper called Hamelitz. Hamelitz, the Advocate, was published in various cities in Russia, eventually Odessa, and this was the first of 2 Hebrew weekly newspapers. Basically, it was the Allgemeine Zeitung, but in Hebrew. This was the place where many Jewish authors were published for the first time. Yud Lamed Gordon, Shalom Aleichem, when they were writing Hebrew poems or Hebrew short stories, Hamelitz was one of the places they would be serialized. Then finally I chose a Hungarian Jewish newspaper called Egyenlőség, which is the Hungarian word for equality. This is the left of center publication of Hungarian Jews. Okay, so there's our little introduction. Now we can talk about the Dreyfus affair and how it was reported in the press and especially in the Jewish press. So I'm going to guess there are things about the Dreyfus affair that are familiar to us. It's something that we've heard. But the first thing I have to say, well, let me say 2 things. First of all, in French history, I don't mean French Jewish history. I mean, in French history, the Dreyfus affair is simply called l'affaire, the incident, the affair. Everybody knows what it is. This is not only an important moment for French Jews, this is an important moment in the history of France. Now, when we talk about the Dreyfus affair, we also have to distinguish between 2 parts. There's the Dreyfus trial, and there's the Dreyfus affair. So the Dreyfus trial was the first part of a larger episode called the Dreyfus Affair. So the big question is, where do we start? And to figure out where we start, let me give you the short version of the story first, and then I'll give you the longer version of the story. So the short version of the story is that an assimilated French Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was accused and convicted of treason for selling military secrets to Germany. That was France's arch enemy in the 1890s. And he was tried and convicted and decommissioned. And in a public ceremony where he was decommissioned, the mob begins to yell, "Death to the Jews." Dreyfus is exiled to Devil's Island. That's the part of the story of the Dreyfus Affair that most people know. But like everything else in Jewish history, it's always more complicated than that. So that's the short version. Let's do a little bit longer version here. So we can't, the story does not start with Dreyfus. This is as much a story about France as it is about an assimilated French Jew. In fact, there was a book written about the Dreyfus Affair about 30 years ago by a historian named Douglas Johnson. He wrote the entire book without once mentioning the fact that Dreyfus was Jewish. There's a good amount, it's a good part of this story that you can tell without mentioning that he's Jewish. Now, obviously, when the crowd starts yelling "Death to the Jews," it has something to do with that he's Jewish. But the point is, there's also a lot of the story which has more to do with of him being French as much as being Jewish. So we don't start in the 1890s when the Dreyfus Affair was. We don't start in 1894. We start a little bit before. So I'll give you a little bit of background, and I put this on that timeline. Here, let me stop the share for a minute. Okay. So first, let me tell you something about French politics. From the end of the 18th century all the way until the present, French politics have always been very schizophrenic. Well, no, now all politics are schizophrenic. They always have these competing points of view, but French politics has been especially schizophrenic. You know, obviously, we have the French Revolution in 1789, which is the birth of liberalism, Republican government. France becomes the cradle of a republic. When I say Republican, I don't mean Republican Party. I mean republic. Now, I don't know if you remember, in 1989, France commemorated the bicentennial of the French Revolution, and man, did they celebrate. They put our bicentennial really to shame. There's just no comparing. But I mention it because in 1989, on the bicentennial of the French Revolution, not all people in France were celebrating. There were people in France who were mourning. If you were the descendant of an aristocratic family that was killed during the Revolution, or lost your land and your estate during the Revolution, the French Revolution was not an event worth celebrating. It was a disaster. It was a catastrophe for France. And that tension between celebrating France as the original republic and lamenting the fact that France was a republic, this is a tension that has been within French politics for 200 years, all the way, and especially through the 19th into the 20th century. One of the reasons why the current French government is known as the Sixth Republic is because the previous republics at some point or another were upended. The Fifth French Republic was upended by the fascist Vichy regime. And we can tell that story all the way back to 1815. The point being is that France, for the last 200 plus years, has been predominantly a liberal republic, but there's always been this conservative counter-current in France, which from time to time asserts itself and sometimes even takes over the country. So that element within French society that happily collaborated with Hitler, that was that French conservative countercurrent, which took Hitler's invasion as the latest in a series of excuses to defeat the French Republic. Now, I mention all of this because Dreyfus isn't only the trial of one individual Jew. Dreyfus emerges as a test of the French Republic. It's a much bigger event than one Jew or even French Jews in general. Now, why would a Jew figure so centrally in the Dreyfus Affair? Well, first and foremost, because one of the things the French Revolution did for the first time is to give Jews full citizenship. France was the first country that enacted a law giving Jews full citizenship, Jewish emancipation. And while those people in France who were supportive, who believed in the Republic, they supported Jewish emancipation, but for that conservative countercurrent that objected to the Republic, the equality of Jews became one of the real stick in your craw points. It became the epitome of everything wrong with France. So, like I said, it's not just a coincidence that he was Jewish, but it wasn't only a critique of the Republic. We have to go a little bit forward now. In 1871, the French Republic, I think it was the third or the fourth, whatever it was defeated by Germany in a war called the Franco-Prussian War. Actually, it was defeated by Prussia, which was about to become Germany in 1871. France, which until this point had this myth of military superiority, not only lost a war to its arch rival Germany, but was forced to cede territory to Germany, a territory in eastern France known as Alsace-Lorraine. Now, just a little background, that territory between France and Germany, Alsace-Lorraine, Germans and French have been fighting over that territory since the time of Charlemagne, like 1,000 years. So losing it to your arch enemy isn't just losing territory. It's losing that epic battle, that mark of which country is better or which country is stronger. So France had to cede Alsace-Lorraine. But it wasn't just, and so there was this humiliation of the French army. And from 1871 on in France, people begin to ask, how could this happen? And of course, one of the reasons that the military came up, it says it wasn't because the military was weaker. We were betrayed by spies. There were spies in France that were loyal to Germany. Now, if you follow that conspiratorial, there was no evidence of it, but if you follow that conspiratorial logic a step further, you ask yourself, where is the most likely place where a spy is going to a spy against France on behalf of Germany is going to come from? In the border province between the two. So the notion was there were spies in France in 1881 undermining the French government and the French military, and they must have been someone from Alsace-Lorraine. Dreyfus's family was from Alsace-Lorraine. Let's call that strike two. If you're a conservative in France, you're not particularly thrilled that Jews are citizens, and an assimilated French Jew like Dreyfus, that's the worst thing about Jews being citizens. They get to become French even though they're outsiders. And he's Alsatian, so he's suspected of being a spy, and he's an officer in the army. So Dreyfus is kind of teed up to be the perfect fall guy. But there's more to this story, because during the few years before the Dreyfus affair, there are other events which are going to raise the tension, raise the temperature in the country, the political temperature in the country. So in this sense, the Dreyfus affair was the third part in a trilogy of late 19th century French politics. So the first event in this trilogy was an event in 1888 known as the Boulanger affair. Now, the Boulanger affair, Boulanger was a conservative general in the army, the French army, who in 1888 attempted a coup to overthrow the French government. Just imagine January 6th if it had succeeded in overthrowing the government. But Boulanger was frightening, but he was defeated by the French army, which remained loyal to the Republic. But this was a moment when that conservative part of France attempted to overthrow the Republic and to do away with everything they didn't like about it. So that was number one. And when Boulanger was defeated, this was a moment of humiliation for not only for the French military, for Boulanger, but also for French conservatives in general. That's number one. The second event was in 1892. In 1892, there was an event in France called the Panama Crisis. Now, it wasn't called the Panama Canal Crisis. Before the Panama Canal was completed in 1901, one of the earlier failed attempts to dig the Panama Canal it was in 1891 and 1892, and it was a French endeavor. And there were several French entrepreneurs who had raised just thousands or millions of French francs to fund the digging of the Panama Canal. And just before the project began, they embezzled all the money. Think of Bernie Madoff, but on a much grander scale. And wouldn't you know it, these French entrepreneurs were all Jews. They were all French Jews. So yes, it's just like Bernie Madoff. Consequently, by the end of 1892, tensions are high. There is this simmering feeling among disenchanted French conservatives that the fact that Jews have free access to French society, are allowed to rise in the French economy and French politics, it leads to something like the Panama Crisis or the Panama Scandal. It would be as if, the far right-wing element, as if white supremacists in our country were singling out Bertie Madoff for the reason everything is wrong. I mean, yes, I know, yes, they are. I guess it's just like the way they single out George Soros for the reason everything is wrong, but much angrier. They're much angrier about it. Now, all of that happens. That brings us to Dreyfus himself. Dreyfus was a captain in the army. He wasn't terribly popular. In fact, one of the things that made Dreyfus somewhat vulnerable is typical, captains in the army, is a junior officer. And most junior officers in the French army would have a mentor, a benefactor, who would basically watch out for them. This person would not only be a senior officer, but typically a member of the nobility, someone well-connected. So if you got into trouble, you would go to your mentor, benefactor, your patron, and that person would protect you. As it turns out, in 1894, by the fall of 1894, Dreyfus was between benefactors. He had one. The benefactor didn't like him not because he was Jewish, really because he was kind of annoying, I guess. That's the way he was described. And so he was sort of mentorless. He didn't have someone to protect him. Now, at this point, what happens is Dreyfus is essentially framed. It's a setup. He is accused of treason. A dossier is presented to a military tribunal ostensibly proving that Dreyfus sold military secrets to Germany. And remember, this is less than a generation after a humiliating defeat to Germany. This is after 20 years of sort of a witch hunt for spies. Dreyfus, the Jew from Alsace-Lorraine, a perfect patsy, is accused of treason, and he's brought to trial. Dreyfus denied it entirely. He's brought to trial in October of 1894, and in December of 1894, as I mentioned at the outset, he is convicted of treason. And that public ceremony, you know how they decommission someone. You've seen it in the old movies. They rip off the epaulets, they take the glove, they slap him across the face, they break the sword. Now, this was supposed to be just a military affair, but typically mobs didn't show up for a military tribunal. But for Dreyfus, there were hundreds and thousands of people watching, and this is when the mob begins to yell death to the Jews. At this point, riots, anti-Jewish riots break out all over France. Okay? Now, that's the Dreyfus trial part of the story. And if the story ended there, we would chalk it up to just another example of the endemic nature of anti-Semitism. But thankfully, this is not where the story ends. In fact, in some ways, this is maybe Act 1. Because Act 2, this brings us to, I think, the more interesting part of the affair. It doesn't end there. Dreyfus is convicted. He's sent to Devil's Island. But French liberals, both Jewish and not, begin to rally on behalf of Dreyfus. Foremost among them was the leading French writer of the age, who was not Jewish, whose name was Émile Zola. Zola was, if you could take the best essayist in the country and roll them together with J.K. Rowling, everybody loved Émile Zola. He was the author. He's sort of Mark Twain Mark Twain times 100. And Zola was absolutely outraged by what was happening, and he joined this rally on behalf of Dreyfus, and he wrote a letter to the Dawn, L'Aurore, and this letter was called J'accuse, I accuse. So let's see. So we've got it right here. All right, look at this is text number 2. We'll come back to number 1 in a second. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let me read a little bit of what he writes. Now, remember, this is him indicting, not just speaking out on behalf of Dreyfus. He's really expressing what this travesty of justice means, not only for a French Jew, but for France. So listen to what he writes. This is text number 2. I accuse the Lieutenant Colonel of Petit Declam of having been the diabolical worker of judicial error, in unconsciousness, I want to believe, and having then defended his harmful work for 3 years by the machinations of the most absurd and the most guilty. I accuse General Mercier of being an accomplice, at least out of weakness of mind, to one of the great inequities of the century. He's accusing the entire general staff. I accuse General Below of having had in his hands certain proof of Dreyfus's innocence and having suffocated them, of being guilty. Skipping down, I accuse General Boisdeffre and General Dons of being accomplices. Okay, now skip down towards the end, about 10 lines from the bottom. I finally accuse the First Council of War of having violated the law by condemning an accused on a room which has remained secret. And I accuse the Second Council of War of having covered up this illegality by order, by committing in turn the legal crime of knowingly acquitting a culprit. In other words, Dreyfus is saying that the travesty here isn't simply a false conviction of an innocent man, but also the cover-up. But the larger story is, and this is the last 4 lines, and the act I am doing here is just a revolutionary way to hasten the explosion of truth and justice. I have only one passion, that of light, in the name of humanity, which has suffered so much and which has the right to happiness. My fiery protest is the only cry of my soul. So dare you put me on trial and let the investigation take place, I wait. In other words, this is a travesty not only against an individual Jew, but against France itself. All of the values, all of the beliefs that make France, France. In other words, for Zola, this cannot be allowed to stand. It's much bigger than that. And here's where, here in a sense, is where the story gets bigger. Because Zola and others, including the members of Dreyfus's own family, were able to rally support on a national scale for Dreyfus. They began a political movement which came to be known as the Dreyfusard movement. In other words, Dreyfusard meaning support, in support of Dreyfus. And this was a grand movement, thousands and thousands of people. You want to get a more recent sense of this? If you remember the protest following the Charlie Hebdo incident a few years ago, that massacre a few years ago, those thousands of people standing arm in arm, railing on behalf of French values. It was that. Now, the organization that the Dreyfusards started as just a protest movement, but it crystallized into a political party. It also gave rise to a counter, to a backlash. A second movement and political party formed known as the anti-Dreyfusards. The anti-Dreyfusards, they were the ones who were defending the decision of the military tribunal, and continuing to condemn Dreyfus. And the anti-Dreyfusards, they were the ones who were repeating all the tropes about why Dreyfus is guilty, because he's a Jew, because he's Alsatian, because he's a spy, even though all of these things had been proven to be falsehoods and simply invented and at best unsubstantiated conspiracies. You know, there was an anti-Semitic writer whose name was Edouard Drumont, who published a newspaper called La Libre Parole, who was disseminating all of this crass anti-Semitic stuff, and Zola and the Dreyfusards were speaking out against it. Okay. Now, originally, the Dreyfus affair started in France, but Jews elsewhere obviously were deeply aware of what was going on. And here is where Jewish newspapers give us a window into how other Jewish communities are responding as well. Or, well, first, even other people around the world were responding as well. One of the first to respond to the plight of Dreyfus in the United States was not an American Jew, but rather the leading American author, Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. Now Samuel Clemens, he abhorred racism and discrimination in all forms. He went to great lengths to mock it, to make fun of it. And also he deplored anti-Semitism. He thought it was contrary to basic human civilization. So he wrote an essay originally in 1895. It was eventually published in a collection in 1900. And this is his essay about the Dreyfus affair. By the way, if you want to see the whole thing, you can go online. It's all online. This is text number 1. Okay. From the beginning, quote, from the beginning of the Dreyfus case to the end of it, all France, except for a couple of dozen moral paladins, lay under the smother of the silent assertion lie that no wrong was being done to a persecuted and unoffending man. In other words, Twain said succinctly what Zola said in a more flowery way. It wasn't just that Dreyfus was innocent. It was the willingness of the French military and then other elements within French society to go along with the prosecution and the false conviction of an innocent person. That was the real crime, and that was the real problem. And Jews elsewhere were aware of this as well. Look how the Dreyfus affair was reported in the Allgemeine Zeitung by German Jews. This is text number 3. All right, now this is part of a longer essay called "The Case of Dreyfus," published in November 1894. Now this is after he was convicted. After he was arrested, before he was convicted. Okay, November of 1894. This is text number 3. Quote, "We have cited these unworthy tirades," meaning they quoted some people, they quoted different voices defending the arrest of Dreyfus. "We have cited these unworthy tirades because they expose the extraordinary vanity that is characteristic of the French." You see, these German Jews, they said the problem here isn't just anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism born of French vanity. Okay, Captain Dreyfus has been branded a traitor. Indeed, since 1870, the once distinguished man of France has withdrawn from the realm of history without even once accusing himself of treachery. Man of France here doesn't mean Dreyfus. It means sort of the ideal French person, the man of France, without even once accusing himself of treachery. The real problem, in other words, is not alleged Jewish treachery, but the unwillingness of French people to accept their own shortcomings. Now, when they spoke of French vanity, they said that the reason that this could happen in France was it was a decadence within French culture and French society. One of the things that Germans often said about French people was they were overly materialistic. They didn't have enough sense of spirituality. And that sort of materialistic greed was what made people indifferent and not defending Dreyfus. Now, look, like I said, this is a German Jewish perspective on France. The fact of the matter is, by this point, there were French people who already begun defending Dreyfus. Okay, now we have a similar sentiment coming from Hungarian Jews as well. So look at text number 5. We'll come back to number 4 in a minute. Okay, in Egyenlőség, in Equality, a Hungarian Jewish writer published an essay in 1895. In other words, this is after Dreyfus was convicted and sent to Devil's Island. And this is called "The Real Anti-Semites." In other words, what is anti-Semitism really about? What's really going on here? And what this author is going to do. Remember, this is a Hungarian Jew, a liberal Hungarian Jew who very much believes in the virtues of Hungarian society as opposed to other Europeans. I don't know if you know any Hungarian Jews or you are one, but you're very proud of being Hungarian. Hungarians are very proud people. I would go so far to say as sometimes they can even be a tad arrogant. A little bit of an understatement. Okay, what does he write? This is the Hungarian Jewish take on the same thing. "The virtuous, uncorrupted Hungarian occasionally scolds and reprimands Jews, and sometimes even Christ himself, but in his heart, he does not hate Jews. On the contrary, he respects the Jew's virtue and his gentle temperament and humor. Indeed, there is not much antipathy towards Jews in the Magyar man. When he does hate a Jew, it's not because he is a Jew, it's for some other reason. It is noteworthy that in the highest circles, the anti-Semitic ulcer is being eliminated." Now, this is being written in 1895, and you're wondering, yes, Hungary, yes, it became such an anti-Semitic place only after World War I. Until World War I, Hungary was virtually devoid of anti-Semitism. It was one of the least anti-Semitic countries on earth, less anti-Semitic than the United States or Great Britain and France, most other places. And here, this is a Hungarian Jew who is expressing this notion that there's something about Hungary which makes Hungarians less anti-Semitic. There's something about France which makes France more anti-Semitic. And what the Hungarians eventually come to conclude is that Hungarians are more moderate in their temperament. It's French radicalism, whether it's radical conservatism or perhaps radical socialism. It's French radicalism which breeds a kind of anti-Semitism and makes it possible for French people not to support Dreyfus. Whereas in Hungary, we tend to be more moderate and centrist, led by moderate and centrist nobles. There, they accept Jews. So this notion that there really is not much anti-Semitism in Hungary in 1895, it's absolutely so. It's absolutely so. Okay. Now, the contest or the struggle between the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards, it began as two movements and turned into two parties. And in the French national election of 1898, the two parties in that election were the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. In other words, in the French national election of 1898, there really was only one issue. And this is a national election. The one issue was Dreyfus, innocent or guilty. Dreyfus trial, travesty or not. Dreyfus affair, betrayal of France or not. But really, it wasn't just Dreyfus. The bigger picture is the survival of the French Republic. And this was what was discussed every single day. And Jews outside of France were very much aware of this. Look at text number 4, also from the Allgemeine Zeitung. In February 1898, not long before this national election, it's right before the election, this is what everyone is talking about, the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. And what does this article say? This is text number 4. The military court condemns Dreyfus as a traitor, but not Dreyfus, rather France is the traitor. In other words, French society, in this case, the French military, French conservative society, has betrayed its own principles. Remember, this is someone living in Germany who for a century, as the Germans have listened to France, claimed to be the cradle of civil rights, of liberty and equality. And this happens at the end of the 1890s. France is the traitor. It betrays its innumerable weaknesses, its moral shortcoming, and its impotence to bestow that which Volk, which means peoplehood, dignity, and majesty bestow. Now, listen to this. Jewish law teaches, if the court errs in its condemnation, the people know that the court erred. There's no hiding that kind of error. If the same court does not offer atonement, then this is wantonness and not mere oversight. In other words, the travesty isn't only a legal travesty or a political travesty, it is a moral travesty. This is the situation in which France finds itself. All France knows that the court erred. Many believe that Dreyfus was condemned unjustly. Now, this attitude, this growing sense that Dreyfus was wrongfully convicted, which began in France and began to emanate elsewhere, it was becoming clearer to more and more people that the conviction of Dreyfus was false, was erroneous, and threatened the survival of the French Republic. And that, as I said, was the issue in the election. And in the national election of 1898, the Dreyfusards defeated the anti-Dreyfusards. In other words, the anti-Semites lost that election. The Dreyfusards won in 1898. Within a few years, this is the part of the story that we don't often hear. Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island. He was retried, he was acquitted, and he was promoted from captain to major in 1904. That's the end of the Dreyfus affair. So this is a story not simply about anti-Semitism. It isn't just another part of the litany of anti-Semitism, but it's a story about how how anti-Semitism, as potent as it may be, or as it was at the turn of the 20th century, was not strong enough to overcome basic forces of decency, of civil rights, of Republican government, liberal values. The anti-Dreyfusards lost. Those who sentenced Dreyfus lost. The military, in its attempt to conceal its own weakness, lost. And Dreyfus eventually, after some difficult years in Devil's Island, was able to come back. And he lived more or less a normal life until he died in France in 1935. So Dreyfus lost in the short run, but he won in the long run, reflecting much more about the situation. But the affair itself continued to resonate. What it really did was it raised awareness of the existence of anti-Semitism, even though the Dreyfusards had won, even though the anti-Semites, the anti-Dreyfusards, these conservative forces were defeated. It alerted people in France and in Germany and in Hungary and all over Europe, and by people I mean Jews and non-Jews alike, to the fact that for all the preaching of how the world was becoming better and the world was progressing, this dark shadow of anti-Semitism and the broader shadow of discrimination, of injustice, which it reflected, was still around. And intellectuals and other people continued to ruminate over, why did this happen? How could it happen in France? How could it happen at the turn of the 20th century, which in the midst of this age of progress? So look at text number 6. Text number 6, we have an essay, another essay written by a Hungarian Jew, reflecting on all of this. This is in January 1898, and this is called Revanche Antisemitism. Antisemitism is revanche anti-Semitism. Revanche is a great French word. It can mean retribution. It can mean retrieval. It can mean revenge. It's sort of a combination of a backlash, an undoing, a vengeance. But this is the notion that anti-Semitism is a kind of backlash against something. So look at what this writer writes. Remember, this is toward the tail end. This is just before the election. This is when this ruminating about the nature of anti-Semitism and why it's still around. Listen to what he writes, quote, "Until now, people would refer to France if they wanted to show a people into which Jews can be absorbed, where religious differences are never the question." Because remember, one of the assumptions about emancipation in France is that it would allow Jews to become, the term they love to use was, French people of the Jewish faith or of the Mosaic religion or whatever phrase they chose. That the difference between Jews and everyone else in France was simply going to be a matter of how you worship, and everything else would be the same. Okay? Jews can be absorbed where religious differences are never the question. Now we can no longer say this. A poisonous breeze blows throughout France, which no one knows when it may become a hurricane. A massive, violent cry passes through the streets of Paris. In the cities of the hinterland, there are even more ardent displays. It is proof that anarchy is the offspring of clericalism. Now, clericalism is an outlook, sometimes it's a movement which elevates the role of clergy, in France, especially Christian clergy, to positions of leadership and prominence and dominance. When justice is blunted, clericalism has a free hand. Clericalism in France, the power of the clergy, and especially the backward nature of the clergy, symbolizes everything that's anti-republic in France, okay? It is beginning to dawn on the French government that clericalist reaction lurks behind this hunt and that it is shutting down the republic, and this is the great danger. And here is the beginning of this, trying to understand the Dreyfus affair in a broader French and even European context. The Dreyfus affair in the end takes the form of political garb. Two great principles, monarchy and republic, struggle against one another. The Dreyfus affair is merely the occasion. This is the latest struggle between two opposing political views, two opposing visions of the future. Until now, it was not known that reaction could take hold of French public opinion. You know, what this is really pointing to is a certain kind of naivete in France, an assumption that the French Republic was so strong and progressive values, liberal values were so deeply entrenched in France that this conservative countercurrent could never really amount to very much. It was an assumption that all we have to do is continue sort of supporting what we do. We don't have to worry about this kind of backlash in France anymore. The Dreyfus affair laid bare how simply unfounded that was, that democracy isn't something that just happens, it's something you have to fight for in every generation. And now I'm sounding like a journalist as well. Okay. The Dreyfus affair is merely the occasion. Not only did we not believe such could happen, but even thoughtless French politicians pointed out that the Dreyfus affair astonished them. They were shocked by it, and it's the shock that really reverberated. No one expected it. Now, in retrospect, to be fair to them, that kind of conservative backlash on that scale hadn't really happened in France in some time. But they were astonished by it. If reaction wins, the republic dies. The state founded on the principles of liberty, equality, fraternity cannot endure the cancer of anti-Semitism. Now the fate of the republic will be truly decided. But what he is really pointing is to the fact that this isn't only about a French Jew or French Jews or even about anti-Semitism. It's about something much, much bigger. Okay? A similar essay, ruminating in a slightly different direction, takes on, points to the dimension of all of this, which wasn't just political in nature, but also racial or racist in nature. Now, remember, the turn of the 20th century, this is the point where racial anti-Semitism is reaching its heyday. This is the point when racial thinkers are dominating the discourse about Jews. And from a racist point of view, remember, racist thinkers believe that there is this struggle between the races for survival, and racial anti-Semites along similar lines believe that the Jewish race, remember, they think of Jews as a race, is in competition for survival with other European races, the Germanic race, the Romance peoples, French and others. And these racial anti-Semites in France believe that the fact that Dreyfus was able to rise to the rank of captain in the military was not something to celebrate. It wasn't a celebration of the French Revolution, but epitomized everything wrong and weak about French society, French politics, and French culture. So look at text number 7 in the middle of page 3. This is an essay called Anti-Semitic Man. What makes an anti-Semite tick, in other words? Quote, medical science diagnoses a sick man by recognizing the origin of his sickness and explaining the possible abnormality of his thought process and his frame of mind. The anti-Semitic man is a new species that leaves all of science, logic, and deduction in the lurch. Now, I think this is something we're somewhat familiar with. If you think about it, it's like trying to argue with someone who believes the QAnon conspiracy. There's no logic to any of that, but logic doesn't matter. And here, this author is suggesting that what makes an anti-Semite anti-Semitic is a lack of logic, of reasoning, science, common sense. The famous Italian psychiatrist Lombroso, distinguishing the anti-Semitic man in the context of natural history, divides people into 3 groups: Homo sapiens, Homo delinquens, and Homo antisemitans. In other words, there are people, there are delinquents, and there are anti-Semites. It is doubtless that the anti-Semite has a particular brain, which always leads him to a result: Jew hatred. And since we observe that Jew hatred appears more frequently en masse in specific regions and among certain peoples, we can safely apply the science of heredity to it so that it's possible to distinguish the anti-Semitic brain from the other two types. Now, look.
Holly,
Yeah.
would you just scroll up a little bit so we can see the rest of that text?
So here we go. There we go. Sorry. Now, first, look, this is turn of the 20th century race science, or explaining the possibility that that being racist is somehow woven into the fabric of someone's personality. It's a little dated in that sense. But leaving that part aside, the irrational nature of anti-Semitism, and more specifically in this instance, the irrational nature, it's so difficult to explain logically why the French military would try to cover up such a transparent farce, humiliating itself. The whole thing is difficult to understand. That's the point. Okay. Now, there's one last essay I want to look at, and then we can have some questions and some discussion. Okay, because in the newspaper Hamilits, remember Hamilits is published in Russia. This is Russian Jews watching. What struck this the Russian Jewish author in Hamilits was not just that Dreyfus happened, but Russian Jews, they were used to more of this kind of discrimination. And this essay pointed out that Dreyfus may have been the most high-profile instance of a Jew being subjected to a Travis of justice, or the most high-profile instance of a trial of a Jew leading to this explosion of anti-Semitism, but it wasn't the only one. And what this essayist points out is a similar kind of case, which, there's the Dreyfus affair, but there's a lesser-known case known as the Schwartz affair. Now, that's what it's called. It's not something from Mel Brooks. It's something actual, okay? What we know from this is that Schwartz was an individual who lived in Alsace, who was falsely accused of a crime, and that false accusation in trial elicited, it spread. The anti-Semitism it elicited. But let me read the description of it to you. And there's something unusual about it, or very telling about it. Okay. Naturally, now, just as a reminder, La Libre Parole is a French anti-Semitic newspaper, and Hamilits is sort of engaging with La Libre Parole, who's the first to report about this Schwartz doing something immoral and illegal. Naturally, the first thing that La Libre Parole wanted to know was whether Schwartz was a Jew. Because remember, the name Schwartz in Germany and in France can sort of go either way, all right? All of its investigations could not clarify this matter. This anti-Semitic newspaper couldn't verify whether the accused, the center of this controversy, Schwartz, was Jewish or not. It would be more accurate to say that, even after it became known that Schwartz was Catholic, the newspaper's goal, in other words, La Libre Parole, the newspaper's goal of disseminating Jew hatred intensified the erroneous assertion that he was Jewish. In other words, the fact emerged that in this case, the accused, Schwartz, was not Jewish but Catholic, but that didn't stop the anti-Semites from turning this into somehow an indictment and condemnation of Jews. What we have here in 1895 is what today we would call an assault on the truth, or an assault or an indifferent to facts. Maybe we'd even call it alternative facts. This is how it looks, okay? It is presumable, writes La Libre Parole, that Schwartz, like Dreyfus, is a Jew, unquote. That's what this anti-Semitic newspaper, even after they knew for a fact that he was not, they continued to say that he was. In this regard, and here's the writer in Hamilits, he concludes, in this regard, the portrayal of Schwartz and Dreyfus was symptomatic of a larger problem. This blatantly illustrates the attitude of a segment of French society toward Jews. We remember that in the case of Dreyfus, not a single French newspaper entertained the possibility that the accused might be innocent. On the contrary, as soon as it became known that Dreyfus was a Jew, the French presumed him to be guilty. One writer tried to outdo the other in revealing the sordid details of the accused's life, when in fact the opposite was true. And this we saw too in the matter of Schwartz. As long as Schwartz was believed to be Jewish, every newspaper rushed to report all the details of his alleged crime, details that inflamed Jew hatred. Okay? In other words, what the writer in Hamelitz is pointing out, that this willingness to believe certain stereotypes about Jews wasn't something only true in the backward-looking conservative sectors of French society, but even more enlightened French people were also predisposed to believe this about Dreyfus. Now, of course, the difference is that more enlightened French people quickly came around as soon as they realized it was a travesty of justice, whereas the more racist people continued to cling to the falsehood that Dreyfus was guilty, okay? And this was, as long as Schwartz was believed to be Jewish, every newspaper rushed to report all the details of his alleged crime, details that inflamed Jew hatred. This evening, it was confirmed that Schwartz is indeed not Jewish. And suddenly the tables are turned. In other words, at that point, let's call them more liberal, open-minded, fact-oriented French newspapers stopped condemning Schwartz, in the same way that the moment that Dreyfus's conviction was shown to be a travesty, none of these fact-oriented newspapers were condemning him anymore, okay? The La Libre Parole, after having devoted 3 front-page columns to the Schwartz case when he was presumed to be Jewish, wrote a large headline, "A new case of Jewish treachery." This is even after he was found to be Catholic, in order to attract its readers' attention. Now devoted only half a column to revealing Schwartz's true identity, but the accusation had been made, and that was the goal. In other words, for an anti-Semitic newspaper, the truth isn't important, it's the accusation. Now, this speaks something very deeply about the power of media at the turn of the 20th century. They were learning for the first time what we are very familiar with, is that as soon as something is out there, as soon as an idea is out there, even if it's a false idea, it's very difficult to rein it in. In fact, this is an example where a lie travels much more quickly than the truth. And Schwartz, this poor man, was continued to be hassled, even though not only that he was innocent, but he wasn't even Jewish, okay? If the opposite became known, what will it matter? And if Schwartz had turned out to be, and what if Schwartz had turned out to be a Jew like Dreyfus? The point is, it's a larger idea about not only the power of anti-Semitism, but the power of the press. So here with Dreyfus, we see 2 things happening simultaneously. The press, those voices like Zola that defended Dreyfus, they used the press to defend him. The Dreyfusard movement would have been unthinkable without a widespread media able to convey and to tell people not only that he was innocent, but to explain why the travesty of justice happened. But by the same token, the same media institutions that disseminated truth were also able to perpetuate the lie, the falsehood that he was guilty. Consequently, even after Dreyfus was acquitted, was retried and acquitted and promoted, and the Dreyfusards won, in the 20th century, there continued to be people in France, typically more conservative, typically more racial thinking, who continued to believe, even in the face of evidence to the contrary, that Dreyfus was guilty all along. And remember what their fallback position was. Well, even if he was proven to be guilty, that's just a conspiracy. Because remember, if you're a racial anti-Semite, you have the default value, or you have the fallback position of Jews control the media. So what do we learn from all of this? What do we learn from the case of Dreyfus? Well, the first is, lest I forget to say, I get asked from time to time, the situation we're in right now, what does it resemble most in the past? Are we in Nazi Germany? Are we in Mussolini's Italy? The answer to that is no and no, but it's possible. To me, the moment we're living in now for the last 5 years or so is the closest parallel to me is the time of Dreyfus, where you have, on the one hand, you have this, well, a lot of people, maybe a majority of people who continue to believe in these basic values like the truth and rights and equality, even for marginalized people like Jews, which Dreyfus was at the turn of the 20th century. But there also is this undercurrent. There is this countercurrent of people, not just who disagree, because remember, it isn't just about disagreeing, but there are people who are so convinced that they are right that they will insist on being right in the face of the truth. Now, I'll tell you something very interesting, because I gave this talk a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. And well, the one thing I wasn't able to say then that I am able to say now is that there's one last parallel. The moment of truth in France came in 1898 when the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards squared off with the future of the French Republic and everything it stood for in the balance, and the Dreyfusards won. And I would suggest that in our own country, we had something analogous, not exactly the same, but we had a moment where these two competing forces stood, they opposed one another, each of which was buttressed by the power of media. Now, for us, it isn't just newspapers. For us, it's social media, but it's powered by media. And just as in France in 1898, the Dreyfusards won, so too, that similar point of view was victorious here as well, to me, thankfully. It would have been a very dark path had the anti-Dreyfusards, so the anti-Dreyfusards won in 1898, it would have been the end of the French Republic. But the other takeaway is that even after that victory, the Dreyfusards didn't just say, oh, we won, let's go back to business as usual. They continued to do the work. They continued to lobby and advocate and to make sure that that which they were defending remained safe and secure. The real takeaway from Dreyfus, and I think one of our own more recent takeaways, is we don't have the luxury or the innocence to take such things for granted. You know, it was President Reagan who said that democracy is not something that happens automatically. Democracy is something that every generation has to fight for. And he's absolutely correct. And the Dreyfus affair, one of the things it shows is that that is absolutely true. And it shows that the power that how something is reported, the power of the press shapes how people perceive things. And well, that one of the reasons Dreyfus was able to be exonerated, and that side was able to win, was the power of the press. But one of the reasons he almost lost was also the power of the press. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Howie.
All right.
We had a couple of questions that came through in the chat. I'll just highlight one, and others can, if you want, you can raise your hand on Zoom and we'll call on you in just a moment. But
you know, if you want, Stephen, I can just go down and answer all these questions if you want.
Go right ahead. All
right. So Salo asked, did anti-Semitism laid bare by the Dreyfus affair provide impetus for Zionism? Yes. Herzl and the Dreyfus affair is a separate story. The short version of it is, of course, Herzl was a reporter at the Dreyfus, witnessed the public conviction of Dreyfus, and he began to write, he began to advocate for Zionism. The longer story is he was already thinking in those directions even before Dreyfus. So Dreyfus didn't invent Zionism in Herzl, but it accelerated it a little bit. It's an important moment. It's not the seminal moment where Herzl went from being indifferent and assimilated to a Zionist. He wasn't immediately transformed, but it crystallized his thinking. Okay. Were Camus or Sartre influenced by these thinkers? Absolutely. Camus and Sartre and every intellectual of that generation and thereafter. For them, Dreyfus was this signature event, and how you understood the world, not only your attitude towards Jews, but your attitude towards other non-Europeans. Not only how you understood anti-Semitism, but how you understood racism and bigotry and discrimination generally. You did not write about that without mentioning Dreyfus. Dreyfus was this signature moment. And for someone like Sartre, Dreyfus was this warning bell, which said that you cannot simply presume that, yes, the Enlightenment happened, and yes, the revolution happened, and yes, there is a Republican government, but complacence is the enemy. So it made Sartre certainly a more active and proactive defender of those values. Okay. Herzl, this is a follow-up question about Herzl. Is the state of Israel today with the family reunification law still largely agreeing with Herzl that multiculturalism fails and different peoples have good reason to be skeptical of each other? That's a great question. That's a different lecture in some ways. But let me connect that to the Dreyfus affair. Okay, because remember, the point of the defenders of Dreyfus, the point is that to be a republic, to be a country and a society founded on liberty and equality and equal rights, either it applies to everyone equally or it applies to no one. It's very much, if everyone isn't equal, then no one is equal. So in Israel, some of the policies passed by the government more recently are moving not in that direction. That's really the dilemma, the challenge of the state of Israel right now. It's asking itself, and this is not an easy question, this is a very difficult question. Can the state of Israel as a democracy be fully inclusive? Now, there's a slightly different issue, because in France, for anti-Semites like Drummond, the threat posed by Dreyfus and by Jews was an imagined threat. There was no real security issue. Yes, there were some Jews in the Panama crisis, some Jews, they embezzled money, but that wasn't posing a physical threat. What makes it more difficult to have this debate in Israel is an argument can be made that the threat is more real and tangible than that. And that does not excuse the state of Israel from its obligation to figure out a way to be inclusive if it wants to be a democracy. But it is the same kind of dilemma. The Dreyfus affair was bringing to the fore the question of, can this state of Israel be Jewish and democratic at the same time? In Dreyfus's time, the question is, can the state be French and democratic at the same time? Can it be fully inclusive of all people, regardless of religion, ethnicity, origin, social class, gender, everything? Can it be fully inclusive or not? Now, the Dreyfus affair was not the end of that conversation. It was merely one dramatic moment. That's a conversation which continues in France to this day. They're just not asking the question about Jews. Now they're asking the question about Muslim immigrants. In Israel too, though, they are asking a similar kind of question. This really is a question that defines 20th century states. Can they be fully inclusive at the same time in light of other issues? I hope that answered the question. Like I said, that's a much bigger question. Okay.
Alan Gale has a question. Go ahead.
What do you got for me, Alan?
So just referring to the Jewish newspapers, did the papers in Germany write in German? Did the papers in France write in French, or did they write in Yiddish or Hebrew?
The Allgemeine Zeitung was German, and Etienne Lecheg was Hungarian. Most Jewish newspapers, they wrote in the vernacular language of the land, but also there were also Hebrew newspapers, and there were also Yiddish newspapers, and there were Ladino newspapers in Turkey. So languages weren't all languages, but these particular newspapers, and probably the best ones, they wrote either in the vernacular or in Hebrew. Yiddish newspapers lagged a little bit behind. They usually weren't as good. And there were also Orthodox newspapers by this point as well. That's an interesting, different story. But no, these were newspapers that were fully reflective of how immersed Jews were in the broader mainstream culture.
And did they have ideology? Did some become Zionist, or were some just simply scandal sheets?
Well, these were the ones I chose. There were Jewish newspapers that were scandal sheets and rags. None of these were all high profile. They were somewhere. The Allgemeine Zeitung was a remarkable cross between the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. These were the best Jewish writers in Germany. It was centrist, maybe a little bit left of center. Etienne Lecheg in Hungary, by Hungarian standards, it was liberal. By our own standards today, it was centrist. It was really very much in the middle. And both the Allgemeine Zeitung and Etienne Lecheg were anti-Zionist until the 1920s. They both embraced Zionism only after the surge of anti-Semitism after the First World War. Hamelitz was initially, well, it was founded before there was Zionism. It embraced Zionism and it embraced the Hebrew Renaissance and was among the first to do. Its political orientation was also, well, I mean, it was writing in Russia. So in Russia, either you were liberal or you were Tsarist. There really wasn't that those, and for Jews, other than Hasidim, most Jews in Russia were trying to get out from under the pressures of the Tsar. So a newspaper like Hamelitz was an agent of trying to change the situation, advocating for the situation of Jews in Russia to improve. Okay.
Howie, thank you, Alan, for the question. Howie, I got a question separately, which isn't in the chat, which would ask this. The person asks, I wonder if I'm the only one who finds the word Jew to be used pejoratively by people. We are Jewish people, people who are Jewish. It is uncomfortable for me when the word Jew is used to refer to us. Wondering what your perspective is on this.
Yes, there is this notion that the word, well, and it isn't just the word Jew. In every language, there is an equivalent of Jew, Judah, Jid, whatever, which has a negative connotation to it, and rightfully so. Jew, you know, really into the 20th century, Jew had a very negative connotation. And if you want to speak more nicely about Jews, you said Hebrew or Israelite. Now, in these Jewish newspapers, when they use the word Jew, first of all, they're writing predominantly for a Jewish audience, but I would say more, this is an example of a take back. These are Jewish writers who are taking back the word Jew, saying that we as Jews, we can use the word Jew in a non-pejorative sense. So if an anti-Semite like Edouard Drummond in an anti-Semitic newspaper used the word Jew, it was just pregnant or just replete with every negative Jewish stereotype. But if a Jewish writer in the Allgemeine Zeitung or Hamelitz or Etienne Lecheg used it, this was using it in a prouder and more venerated sense. So really, it's a more subjective thing. But you know, they were aware of what it meant, but they also they did it self-consciously and they did it deliberately. They're basically saying that, you know, we are confident enough in the status and the situation of Jews. We're going to call ourselves Jews, and we're going to do it proudly.
Great. Okay. Any final questions for this evening? Okay. So before we sign off, just want to again thank people for being with us. Thank you to Howie for being our teacher tonight. I'm going to share in the chat a couple of classes that are coming up in August. For those, we'll mention them again along the way, but just so people have them, a couple of classes that are going to be coming up. And in the meantime, we are looking forward to having you back next week. And for the entire series, you are here and got to hear it in person. We will post the recording sometime pretty soon for those who want to go back to any of it. But thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for being here.
And next week,